In Athens, the 30 tyrants, who were in supreme control, made no end out of daily exiling some citizens and putting to death others. When the Thebans were displeased at what was taking place and extended kindly hospitality to the exiles, Thrasybulus of the Dame of Styria, as he was called, who was an Athenian and had been exiled by the 30, with the secret aid of the Thebans seized a stronghold in Attica called Phyle. This was an outpost, which was not only very strong, but was also only 100 states distant from Athens, so that it afforded them many advantages for attack. The 30 tyrants, on learning of this act, at first led forth their troops against the band, with the intention of laying siege to the stronghold. But while they were encamped near Phyle, there came a heavy snow, and when some set to work to shift their encampment, the majority of the soldiers assumed that they were taking to flight and that a hostile force was at hand, and the uproar which men call panic struck the army, and they removed their camp to another place. The 30, seeing that those citizens of Athens who enjoyed no political rights in the government of the 3,000 were elated at the prospect of the overthrow of their control of the state, transferred them to Piraeus and maintained their control of the city by means of mercenary troops, and accusing the Eleusinians and Salaminians of siding with the exiles, they put them all to death. While these things were being done, many of the exiles flocked to Thrasybulus, and the 30 dispatched ambassadors to Thrasybulus, publicly to treat with him about some prisoners, but privately to advise him to dissolve the band of exiles and to associate himself with the 30 in the rule of the city, taking the place of Theramenes, and they promised further that he could have license to restore to their native land any 10 exiles he chose. Thrasybulus replied that he preferred his own state of exile to the rule of the 30, and that he would not end the war unless all the citizens returned from exile and the people got back the form of government they had received from their fathers. The 30, seeing many revolting from them because of hatred and the exiles growing ever more numerous, dispatched ambassadors to Sparta for aid, and meanwhile themselves gathered as many troops as they could and pitched a camp in the open country near Acharnae, as it is called. Thrasybulus, leaving behind an adequate guard at the stronghold, led forth the exiles, 1,200 in number, and delivering an unexpected attack by night on the camp of his opponents, he slew a large number of them, struck terror into the rest by his unexpected move, and forced them to flee to Athens. After the battle, Thrasybulus set out straight away for the Piraeus and seized Munichia, which was an uninhabited and strong hill, and the tyrants with all the troops at their disposal went down to the Piraeus and attacked Munichia under the command of Critias. In the sharp battle, which continued for a long time, the 30 held the advantage in numbers and the exiles in the strength of their position. At last, however, when Critias fell, the troops of the 30 were dismayed and fled for safety to more level ground, the exiles not daring to come down against them. When after this great numbers went over to the exiles, Thrasybulus made an unexpected attack upon his opponents, defeated them in battle, and became master of the Piraeus. At once, many of the inhabitants of the city, who wished to be rid of the tyranny, flocked to the Piraeus, and all the exiles who were scattered throughout the cities of Greece, on hearing of the successes of Thrasybulus, came to the Piraeus, so that from now on the exiles were far superior in force. In consequence, they began to lay siege to the city. The remaining citizens in Athens now removed the 30 from office and sent them out of the city, and then they elected 10 men with supreme power first and foremost to put an end to the war in any way possible, on friendly terms. But these men, as soon as they had succeeded to office, paid no attention to these orders, but established themselves as tyrants and sent to Lacedaemon for 40 warships and 1,000 soldiers under the command of Lysander. But Pausanias, the king of the Lacedaemonians, being jealous of Lysander and observing that Sparta was in ill repute among the Greeks, marched forth with a strong army, and on his arrival in Athens brought about a reconciliation between the men in the city and the exiles. As a result, the Athenians got back their country and henceforth conducted their government under laws of their own making, and the men who lived in fear of punishment for their unbroken series of past crimes they allowed to make their home in Eleusis. The Eleans, because they stood in fear of the superior strength of the Lacedaemonians, brought the war with them to an end, agreeing that they would surrender their triremes to the Lacedaemonians and let the neighboring cities go free. And the Lacedaemonians, now that they had brought their wars to an end and were no longer concerned with them, advanced with their army against the Messenians, of whom some were settled in an outpost on Cephallenia and others in Naupactus, which the Athenians had given them among the western Locrians. Driving the Messenians from these regions, they returned the one outpost to the inhabitants of Cephallenia and the other to the Locrians. The Messenians, being now driven from every place because of their ancient hatred of the Spartans, departed with their arms from Greece, and some of them, sailing to Sicily, took service as mercenaries with Dionysius, while others, about 3,000 in number, sailed to Cyrene and joined the forces of exiles there. For at that time disorder had broken out among the Cyrenaeans, since Ariston, together with certain others, had seized the city. Of the Cyrenaeans, 500 of the most influential citizens had recently been put to death, and the most respected among the survivors had been banished. The exiles now added the Messenians to their number and joined battle with the men who had seized the city, and many of the Cyrenaeans were slain on both sides, but the Messenians were killed almost to a man. After the battle, the Cyrenaeans negotiated with each other and agreed to be reconciled, and they immediately swore oaths not to remember past injuries and live together as one body in the city. At this same time, the Romans increased the number of colonists in the city, known as velitrae. At the close of this year, in Athens, Laches was archon, and in Rome, the consulship was administered by military tribunes Manius Claudius, Marcus Quincius, Lucius, Julius, Marcus Furius, and Lucius Valerius, and the 95th Olympiad was held, that in which Minos of Athens won the stadion. This year, Artaxerxes, the king of Asia, after his defeat of Cyrus, had dispatched Tissaphernes to take over all the satrapies which bordered on the sea. Consequently, the satraps and cities which had allied themselves with Cyrus were in great suspense, lest they should be punished for their offences against the king. Now all the other satraps, sending ambassadors to Tissaphernes, paid court to him and in every way possible arranged their affairs to suit him. But Thamos, the most powerful satrap who commanded Ionia, put on triremes his possessions and all his sons, except one whose name was Glos and who became later commander of the king's armaments. Thamos then, in fear of Tissaphernes, sailed off with his fleet to Egypt and sought safety with Psammetichus, the king of the Egyptians, who was a descendant of the famous Psammetichus. Because of a good turn he had done the king in the past, Thamos believed that he would find in him a haven, as it were, from the perils he faced from the king of Persia. But Psammetichus, completely ignoring both the good turn and the hallowed obligation due to suppliants, put to the sword the man who was his suppliant and friend, together with his children, in order to take for his own both Thamos' possessions and his fleet. When the Greek cities of Asia learned that Tissaphernes was on his way, they were deeply concerned for their future and dispatched ambassadors to the Lacedaemonians, begging them not to allow the cities to be laid waste by the barbarian. The Lacedaemonians promised to come to their aid and sent ambassadors to Tissaphernes to warn him not to commit any acts of aggression against the Greek city. Tissaphernes, however, advancing with his army against the city of the Cimmerians first, both plundered its entire territory and got possession of many captives. After this he laid siege to the Cimmerians, but on the approach of winter, since he was unable to capture the city, he released the captives for a heavy ransom and raised the siege. The Lacedaemonians appointed Thybron commander of the war against the king, gave him 1,000 soldiers from their own citizens, and ordered him to enlist as many troops from their allies as he should think desirable. Thybron, after going to Corinth and summoning soldiers from the allies to that city, set sail for Ephesus with not more than 5,000 troops. Here he enrolled some 2,000 soldiers from his own and other cities and then marched forth with a total force of over 7,000. Advancing some 120 stades, he came to Magnesia, which was under the government of Tissaphernes. Taking this city at the first assault, he then advanced speedily to Tralles in Ionia and began to lay siege to the city. But when he was unable to achieve any success because of its strong position, he turned back to Magnesia. And since the city was unwalled and Thybron therefore feared that, at his departure, Tissaphernes would get control of it, he transferred it to a neighboring hill, which men call Thorax. Then Thybron, invading the territory of the enemy, glutted his soldiers with booty of every kind. But when Tissaphernes arrived with strong cavalry forces, he withdrew for security to Ephesus. At this same time, a group of the soldiers who had served in the campaign with Cyrus and had got back safe to Greece went off each to his own country, but the larger part of them, about 5,000 in number, since they had become accustomed to the life of a soldier, chose Xenophon for their general. And Xenophon with this army set out to make war on the Thracians who dwell around Salmydessus. The territory of this city, which lies on the left side of the Pontus, stretches for a great distance and is the cause of many shipwrecks. Accordingly, the Thracians made it their practice to lie in wait in those parts and seize the merchants who were cast ashore as prisoners. Xenophon, with the troops he had gathered, invaded their territory, defeated them in battle, and burned most of their villages. After this, when Thybron sent for the soldiers with the promise to hire them, they withdrew to join him and made war with the Lacedaemonians against the Persians. While these events were taking place, Dionysius founded in Sicily a city just below the crest of Mount Aetna and named it Adranum, after a certain famous temple. In Macedonia, King Archelaus was unintentionally struck while hunting by Craterus, whom he loved and met his end after a reign of 7 years. He was succeeded on the throne by Orestes, who was still a boy, and was slain by Eropus, his guardian, who held the throne for 6 years. In Athens, Socrates, the philosopher, who was accused by Anytus and Meletus of impiety and of corrupting the youth, was condemned to death and met his end by drinking the hemlock. But since the accusation had been undeserved, the people repented, considering that so great a man had been put to death. Consequently, they were angered at the accusers and ultimately put them to death without trial. At the end of the year, in Athens, Aristocrates entered the office of Archon, and in Rome the consular magistracy was taken over by 6 military tribunes, Gaius Servilius, Lucius Virginius, Quintus Servilius, Lucius Virginius, Quintus Sulpicius, Aulus Mutilius, and Manius Sergius. After these magistrates had entered office, the Lacedaemonians, learning that Thybron was conducting the war inefficiently, dispatched Dercyllidas as general to Asia, and he took over the army and advanced against the cities in the Troad. Now Hamaxitus and Colonae and Arispar he took at the first assault, then Ilium and Cerbinia and all the rest of the cities of the Troad, occupying some by craft and conquering the others by force. After this, he concluded an armistice of 8 months with Pharnabazus and advanced against the Thracians who were dwelling at that time in Bithynia, and after laying waste their territory, he led his army off into winter quarters. In Trachinian Heraclea, civil discord had arisen, and the Lacedaemonians sent Euripides there to restore order. As soon as Euripides arrived in Heraclea, he called an assembly of the people, and surrounding them with his hoplites, he arrested the authors of the discord and put them all to death, some 500 in number. And since the inhabitants about Oide had revolted, he made war on them, subjected them to many hardships, and forced them to leave their land. The majority of them, together with their children and wives, fled into Thessaly, from where they were restored to their homes 5 years later by the Boeotians. While these events were taking place, the Thracians invaded the Chersonesus in great multitudes, laid waste the whole region, and held its cities beleaguered. The inhabitants of the Chersonesus, being hard-pressed in the war, sent for the Lacedaemonian Dercyllidas to come from Asia. He, crossing over with his army, drove the Thracians out of the country and shut off the Chersonesus by a wall which he ran from sea to sea. By this act he prevented any future descent of the Thracians, and after being honored with great gifts, he transported his army of the Asia. Pharnabazus, after the truce had been made with the Lacedaemonians, went back to the king and won him over to the plan of preparing a fleet and appointing Conon the Athenian as its admiral. For Conon was experienced in the encounters of war, and especially in combat with the present enemy, and although he excelled in warfare, he was at the time in Cyprus at the court of Evagores the king. After the king had been persuaded, Pharnabazus took 500 talents of silver and prepared to fit out a naval force. Sailing across to Cyprus, he ordered the kings there to make ready 100 triremes, and then, after discussions with Conon about the command of the fleet, he appointed him supreme commander at sea, giving indications in the name of the king of great hopes Conon might entertain. Conon, in the hope not only that he would recover the leadership in Greece for his native country if the Lacedaemonians were subdued in war, but also that he would himself win great renown, accepted the command. And before the entire fleet had been made ready, he took the 40 ships which were at hand and sailed across to Cilicia, where he began preparations for the war. Pharnabazus and Tissaphernes gathered soldiers from their own satrapies and marched out, making their way towards Ephesus, since the enemy had their forces in that city. The army accompanying them numbered 20,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. On hearing of the approach of the Persians Dercyllidas, the commander of the Lacedaemonians, led out his army, having in all not more than 7,000 men. But when the forces drew near each other, they concluded a truce and set a period of time during which Pharnabazus should send word to the king regarding the terms of the treaty, should he be ready to end the war, and Dercyllidas should explain the matter to the Spartans. So upon this understanding, the commanders dispersed their armies. The Law editor's notes, one here and often below the word translated exile, may include not only those who had been legally sentenced to exile, but also others who had voluntarily fled Athens. 2. These were chosen by the 30, as Xenophon states, Hell 2.3:18, to share in the government. 3. A statement to this general effect must have been in the Greek. 4. I.e. file. 5. Athens. 6. Key P. Book 11.84, 7. 7. Livy 5.1 gives the names as M. Aemilius Mamercus, L. Valerius, Potitus, Ap. Claudius Crassus, M. Quintilius Varus, L. Iulius, Iulus, M. Postumius, M. Postumius, M. Postumius Albinus, and M. Postumius Albinus. 8. Psammetichus I, 664-610 BCE, the founder of the 26th dynasty, who fostered trade relations with the Greeks, Q-Pi relations with the Greeks, 2.151, 151, 154. 9. Xenophon, Hell 3.14, says that these were emancipated helots. 10. CP, chaps. 1931. 11. A city on the west shore of the Black Sea, some 60 miles from the Bosporus. 12. Xenophon, Anab 7.5, 12, states that shoals extend far and wide. 13. That of the god Adranus, the reputed father of the Palissi, who were worshipped throughout all Sicily. See Book 11.886, 89. Plutarch, Timoleon 12.2. 14. Archelaus was king 413, 399 BC. 15. This statement is to be doubted in the case of Meletus and is definitely false with respect to the other accusers of Socrates. 16. There are only 5 names in the miss. Vary greatly. Livy 5.8 lists Gaius Servilius, Ahala, Quintus Servilius, Lucius Virginius, Quintus Sulpicius, Aulus Manlius, and Manius Sergius. 17. Xenophon, Hell 3.2, 10, says that the isthmus was only 37 stades, some 5 miles, wide where the wall was built. Cup. Pliny, Hist. Nat. 4.43. 18. i.e. the Lacedaemonians, but the text may have mentioned instead his special experience in fighting at sea. Keep. Critical note. The critical note to the Greek text, Kai Malista ton Polemion, reads, Polemion nautikon Wesseling Pelagian Dindorf. Worm suggests Aganon Niumachio. 19. Conon had taken refuge with him after the Battle of Argospotami, fearing to train to Athens. Book 13.106. The previous, next to images with borders, lead to more information. The thicker the border, the more information. Details here, thanks to John Alendering of Livius for sharing in the labor of proofreading the web transcription of this book. Up to Diodorus Classical Texts, Lacus Curtius Home, a page or image on this site is in the public domain only if its URL has a total of 1 asterisk. If the URL has 2 asterisks, the item is copyright someone else and used by permission or fair use. If the URL has none, the item is C. Bill Thayer. See my copyright page for details and contact information. Page updated 3/8/18.